Ho, 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 ho. Merry Christmas. It's me, Santa Claus. And I'm back to read you another chapter in our book, A Miracle on 34th Street. We're on chapter 8 today. So let's go ahead and we'll just dive right in because last we left, things were getting kind of exciting, weren't they? So we'll go to chapter 8 and see what's going on now. To Doris, Mr. Kringle was still just a slightly touched old gentleman, but in the next few days she found that, sane or not, his influence was spreading amazingly and with astonishing results. Mr. Macy had carried out his plan to put Chris's policy into effect. Every employee throughout the great store cheerfully recommended other concerns and products to his or her customers. He had followed this up with a series of large advertisements in all the New York papers. Not only had Macy's already gained many new accounts, but the idea was spreading to other stores. One block down from 34th Street, for example, Mr. Gimble threw the Macy ad angrily across his desk and turned to his assembled staff. "Why didn't one of you think of this?" he fumed. "Now Macy is suddenly a benevolent spirit, thinking only of the welfare of the public? And what does that make me? A profiteering money grubber?" "Well, two can play at that game. From now on, if we haven't got what a customer wants, send him over to Macy's." And so it started to grow. Other stores quickly followed suit. This new idea became the subject of editorials in the newspapers. Articles began to appear in magazines. Radio comedians made quips about it. Almost overnight, it spread from coast to coast. Mr. Kringle, the center and symbol of the whole idea, was receiving an incredible amount of publicity. In spite of herself, Doris was impressed. She admitted as much as she and Chris went home together one evening. "Little did I dream," she told him, "when I saw you standing next to that float, that I was picking out the man who was going to revolutionize the entire merchandising business." "Neither did I," Chris admitted. "I'm very glad that I did it," said Doris. Mr. Kringle smiled happily. It was the first good sign, and he was quite encouraged. He seemed to be making progress in other directions, for on Sunday, Chris went for a walk in the park with his cane on one arm and Susan on the other. Inevitably, they wound up at the zoo. Chris stopped to feed the reindeer. As usual, they came running to him and ate out of his hand. Susan was very much impressed. It wasn't just the reindeer either. Being with Mr. Kringle was always an exciting adventure. He was full of all sorts of jokes and jingles and stories. Her mother would not approve, she felt sure, but it was a lot of fun. Now, as they walked along together, the old man broached the subject of her Christmas wish. It didn't seem right to him that a little girl like Susan had no wishes at all. She must want something. Every child did. Susan hesitated a long time before she answered. She had only one wish, and it was a big one. Oh no. If he was really Santa Claus, she thought to herself, he could make it come true. And so she told Chris her one wish was for a house. A real house, not a toy one, where she and her mother could live. Living in a New York apartment was not much fun for a girl her age. The house would have a real big yard with trees in it and a swing. Then she could just run out and play any time she wanted, instead of having to wait for Cleo or someone to take her to Central Park. Chris gulped. "That's quite a tall order," he admitted, "but I'll do my best." "Well," said Susan with conviction, "if you're really Santa, you can get it for me. And if you can't, then you're only a nice man with a white beard like Mother says." Chris realized the challenge. Susan was a mighty shrewd little girl, and she placed him squarely on the spot. She did, too, yeah. From inside her little purse, she took the very worn and folded page of a magazine and handed it to him. It was a drawing, an architect's dream of a charming little colonial house. Susan explained the floor plan to Chris in great detail. "Whew! What a tough order," thought the old man as he pocketed the drawing. He began to worry a little himself. "Every child can't get every wish," Chris told her. "But that doesn't mean that there isn't a Santa Claus. Some children wish for things they couldn't use if they got them. Lots of little boys want real locomotives, for example. Why, they couldn't even get them into their houses. And little girls wish for baby brothers and sisters, even though their parents wouldn't be able to care for them properly. And besides, he continued, if every child got what he wanted right away, life wouldn't be half so much fun now, would it? Sometimes it's better to keep on wishing so that when you get your wish, you really appreciate it. In other words, Chris concluded, there are lots of reasons why every wish a child makes can't come true. Susan could see that he was right in certain cases. Excuse me. But I've wished for this house a long time, Mr. Kringle, she told him, and I'll appreciate it if I get it. There was nothing more that Chris could say. It was up to him now, and he knew it. That night, as Fred and he were going to bed, Mr. Kringle began his campaign. He realized there was only one way he could make Susan's wish come true. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Gailey might live in such a house. Oh, he's scheming. Well, I'm scheming. I'm Santa Claus. But Doris Walker could obviously never swing it alone, and so he casually questioned Fred about his relationship with Doris. Fred was very frank about it. He admitting being in love with Doris. And then our picture says Susan had only one wish, and it was a big one. And here's Santa Claus and Susan at the park. Here they are. Yeah. Where she wishes for the house. But Fred also admitted that he could make no headway at all. He told Chris the story of her first marriage and what it had done to Doris. Now her whole life was organized about her daughter and her career to the complete exclusion of any normal social activities. Doris saw to it that she had no private life at all. Chris nodded sadly. Doris is only one example, he said. That is what's happening to thousands and thousands of people in the world. I'm afraid you're right, said Fred. We've got to do something about it right away, said Chris with determination. You're right, we do, said Fred, but I wish I knew just what. Mr. Kringle was full of ideas. He persuaded Fred to take Doris out to dinner the following evening. Fred was only too eager to ask her, but she had steadfastly refused up to now. This time Chris convinced him. Things would be different. He would see to that. The next morning, Chris gave Doris a great sales talk about her neighbor, Mr. Gailey. Doris seemed to agree with everything he said. He also quite casually mentioned the need for recreation, especially for someone who worked as hard as Doris, and again, she agreed. So when Fred appeared in the toy department at closing time, Chris beamed at him happily as he left the dais. Fred had come to take Doris to dinner, hadn't he? Fred shook his head. Mrs. Walker was much too busy as usual. She was working the whole evening. Her dinner would be a sandwich and coffee at her desk. So Fred had stopped by for Chris. He thought they could go home together. Oh, I see, said Mr. Kringle dryly. Well, she's too busy to see you, eh? Well, perhaps if I talk to her. It's no use, Fred told him. I've talked myself hoarse. I see, Chris mused. Well, we'll have to think of something. There was a peculiar glint in Mr. Kringle's eyes as he retired to the locker room to change. It seemed to Fred that he took a long time about it, too. Finally, he went back to the locker room to find Chris, but the old man had gone. He had taken the service elevator down quite some time ago, the porter told him. What was Chris up to? Fred decided to return to Doris's office and use the phone. Cleo had not seen him, and nobody answered the phone in Fred's apartment. Doris called the Maplewood home, but he had not been there. By now, Doris had become quite alarmed. Chris had punched his time card and placed it in the rack as usual when he left the store. That had been nearly 3 hours ago. I wonder where he went. But if Chris had met with disaster, they could find no trace of it. They checked all the police stations, hospitals, and remembering Mr. Sawyer's dire predictions, Doris, with her heart in her mouth, even called the psychopathic ward at Bellevue. Chris was no place to be found. As the evening wore on and their search continued, Doris's anxiety grew, and it was not based entirely on Mr. Macy and her job. Fred was surprised to find that Doris had grown much fonder of Mr. Kringle than she herself realized. I'm frankly amazed at you, he told her. Why? Asked Doris. Well, it's not like you at all, he told her. The efficient, businesslike Mrs. Walker getting so upset about an eccentric old man. Chris is not just an eccentric old man, Fred, said Doris. He's much more than He's... Doris couldn't find the words. I know just what you mean, said Fred, trying to conceal his elation, but all the efforts gained them nothing. They could find no trace of Mr. Kringle anywhere. Finally, heartsick and exhausted, Fred took Doris home. On the way, they stopped off at the Central Park Zoo, but Jim had not seen Chris since last Sunday, when he had brought the little girl. That was the last straw. Now all they could do was wait and hope, and to add to Doris's unhappiness, she had lost a lovely little brooch, a treasured heirloom, and they had been to so many places all through the store, the zoo, and in cabs, that she knew she'd never see it again. When Fred left Doris at the door to her apartment, she was on the verge of tears. Oh, poor Doris. His heart went out to her, but he knew her too well to say anything that might sound tender or comforting. The evening had brought them closer than they had ever been before, but any acknowledgement of this, he knew, would only frighten her right back into her shell again. So he simply said good night and turned to go. But Doris seemed reluctant to see him leave. She wanted to thank him for all he'd done. I don't know how I could ever have gone through the evening without you, she said. Fred smiled quietly. You see, a man does come in handy every once in a while, he said. I'm glad I could be helpful. You were more than helpful, Fred, she said. And I'm more than grateful. He could see the tears welling up in her eyes now. She took a little step toward him and raised her head, and for a fleeting second, Fred thought she was going to kiss him. But something quickly caught her and held her face frozen into a smile. Good night, said Fred softly as he closed the door. He was still smiling warmly to himself as he entered his dark apartment. If it hadn't been for Chris, it would have been a wonderful evening. He was still puzzled by the old man's disappearance. At first he felt it was some trick that Chris was playing, but as the evening wore on, a cold fear had begun to grip his heart. If anything had really happened to Mr. Kringle, the world would never be the same. As he snapped on the light in the bedroom, Fred suppressed a bellow, for there in his bed lay Mr. Kringle, peacefully asleep. Fred quickly snapped off the light again, but Chris was already sitting up eagerly and asked Fred what had happened. We nearly went crazy. That's what happened, Fred told him. You mean to say you've been here all the time? Chris nodded with a chuckle. Why didn't you answer the phone? Fred asked. We didn't know what had happened to you. Doris and I have been chasing all over town. Oh, you have you? Said Chris with a twinkle in his eye. Didn't you enjoy it? Didn't you two get together? Well, yes, Fred was forced to admit that they had. Chris grinned with satisfaction. That's exactly what I hoped would happen. I'll have to try it again. No, Fred pleaded anxiously. There must be easier ways. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Fred told him, trying his best to look angry. Think of all the worry you caused Doris. I'm going over and tell her what a fiend you are before the poor girl spends a sleepless night. Yes, do. By all means, said Chris, beaming. That'll give you a little more time together. Doris came to the door in a sheer, ruffled dressing gown, her hair streaming down her back. Fred had never seen her looking so feminine or appealing before. She seemed to be another person, a soft, alluring contrast to the severely tailored Mrs. Walker he had left a few minutes ago. Doris was so relieved by the news he'd brought that she quite forgot her appearance as she let Fred in. But she couldn't understand it. Why had the old man done it? Where had he gone? Fred tried gingerly to explain. It seems Mr. Kringle is playing Cupid as well as Santa Claus, he said. He thinks we're two nice people and that we should spend more time together. Oh, said Doris, but she didn't even seem to mind the idea nearly as much as Fred thought she would. That's why he did it, and I'll bet the old fox is peeping at us from the window right now, Fred concluded. Well, in that case, you'd better stay and have a cup of coffee, said Doris. Chris could see into her living room from his bedroom, she pointed out. Fred very happily accepted the invitation. Fred enjoyed the next half hour more than any he could remember, for there was Doris next to him on the couch, and his arm was around her. Every time she moved away, Fred suddenly noticed that Chris was peeking at them, of course. Half the time, Chris wasn't there. Finally, Fred could no longer use Mr. Kringle for an excuse, and it was obvious that the old man must have been asleep a long time. As he rose to leave, there came a terrified cry from Susan in her bed. The child was having a nightmare. Fred rushed into her room and caught Susan up in his arms. Doris followed, standing near the doorway. As Fred quietly comforted her, Susan slowly awoke from the dream, and as she saw Fred, a smile of happiness broke out on her tear-streaked face. "Oh, Uncle Fred, it's you," she said with great relief and reassurance. She had had an awful dream, but now that Uncle Fred was here, everything was all right. Doris was deeply moved by the little scene and strangely touched by her daughter's devotion to Uncle Fred. As Fred said goodnight to Doris, he took her tenderly in his arms and kissed her, and neither of them mentioned Mr. Kringle or the act they were supposed to be putting on. Well, what an exciting chapter, my goodness. All sorts of things going on there. Apparently, Mr. Kringle is a bit of a trickster, but it gave him what he wanted. He wants them to be together, and they can all be one happy family, and Susan can get her house. We'll have to wait and see, though, because that's the end of the chapter. I'll be back with chapter 9 tomorrow. And in the meantime, you have a Merry, Merry Christmas. I hope things are going well for you out there. And I will see you again tomorrow. Goodbye.